Woo!
Do you remember your first day here?
I do, very well. I took, at that stage, Marshes was really virtually deserted. People had forgotten about it. And I was had a dinner party one night, and a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm not doing anything. My children are in school. I'm going mad. I don't know what to do." And she said, "Have you ever heard of Marsh's Library?" I said, "No." Well, she said, "I really think you'd love it." And so she told me where it was, and I came. And it took 3 visits before I could get in because there was nobody here. And then I did come in, and the deputy keeper at the time, was a very nice clergyman who welcomed me. And so I started to work here. And gradually I began to come in for longer and longer periods. And then some years ago, they made me keeper of the library, which was entirely a male job before that.
I just wonder, how long have you worked here yourself?
40 years.
40 years. Have you enjoyed it?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I have.
What do you like about the place?
First of all, the books are magnificent. And the fact that it's unchanged. This is a purpose-built library. This was specifically designed as a public library forever, which is not allowed. You cannot use the word in legislation forever anymore. Not for a long, long time, I think. But it's in our Act of Parliament as a public library forever. And it was to be open to all graduates and gentlemen who were to give place and pay due respect to their betters. So the remarkable business of collecting a library and spending every penny you had on building it, getting a famous architect to design it, and leaving it as a public library forever. I think that is an act of superb generosity. And he didn't call it after himself either. It was known as the Library of St. Sepulchre. It wasn't until much later that I think some of the governors decided to change it to Marsh's Library. And of course it's been used by famous writers, including William Carton Maturin, who wrote the famous Gothic novels, Bram Stoker, and of course in recent times then we had James Joyce. As he used to wander around the Liberties. It was very well known that he did. And he come in here. Now, at that stage, this library was deserted. And in the French librarian, who was the Huguenot refugee who became librarian of Marsh's, he came in and asked to see a book, The Prophecies of Joachim Abbas. Now, since almost nothing has changed in Marsh's library, that book is still in the same place where it was put by Archbishop Marsh and Dr. Buero, the first librarian. And so it's handed to Joyce. And in Ulysses, Joyce says, "Come out of it, Stephen. Beauty is not there, nor in the stagnant bay of Marsh's library, where you read the fading prophecies of Joachim Abbas." I mean, there are books here that one of them was printed in 1472. It is beautiful and in perfect condition, printed in Italy in 1472. And you have to admire the scholarship of these books, the way they were collected, the previous owners, John Donne, Ben Jonson, and many, many other famous writers. And of course, the greatest writer of all, Jonathan Swift, was a governor of Marsh's. As Dean of St. Patrick's, you're automatically a governor of Marsh's under the Act of Parliament of 1707. And of course, he came in here. Unfortunately, he hated Archbishop Marsh. Marsh didn't trust Swift, didn't promote him, held back promotion from time to time. But Swift, you have to be very careful of good Irish writers because they'll always get their own back on you. And of course, Swift, when he thought Marsh was dying, wrote this awful piece about him in which he said, "Marsh has a reputation for great scholarship. He's a bit like a rusty old iron chest. If you don't open him up, you won't know what's in him anyway. Sit well away from him in summer because he smells," but he didn't quite put it like that. And then he said, "And no man will be either glad or sorry at his death, except his successor." Tough. Well, there are some wonderful stories about Marsh's, as you can imagine, in a library that's over 300 years old. But my own favourite, I think, is the story of Professor Robert Travers, who was deputy keeper of the library. Very eccentric man, very clever, a wonderful book collector, and he was absolutely devoted to this library. He arrived in the 19th century. The reason he came to Marshes is very interesting. He said when he was a student in Trinity, he met a young girl, and she capriciously rejected him. So he never really recovered from it, actually. But from that on, he came up to Marshes, actually, until within a few weeks of his death. But he was married, he had a family, he was very eccentric, there's no doubt about it, and I think a rather cold character, but as I said, devoted to this library. And in the 19th century, I think in about 1862-3, he had a family, of course, and he had a daughter called Mary Josephine Travers. And she became acquainted with Sir William Wilde because her mother thought she was going deaf, and she brought Mary Josephine to see Sir William Wilde, of course, who was a specialist. And Sir William fell for her in a big way. He took her to all kinds of social functions and treated her very well. And then after a few years, he got tired of her and he tried to get rid of her. And she wasn't having it. She was rather clever, actually, but definitely, like her father, I think a bit eccentric. And so she started to follow Sir William Wilde all around the place when he was giving lectures. And she followed him then to one particular hall, the Metropolitan Hall, where he was giving a very important lecture. And she hired newsboys carrying placards with dreadful things about Sir William Wilde. And then she wrote a notice of her death, which she delivered to the newspapers. So Lady Wilde was getting more and more fed up with this. This is the great Speranza. And she was getting more and more fed up. She put up with it for a long time, and then she suddenly, the last episode of Mary Joseph, whatever she did, I don't quite know, but she really irritated Lady Wilde. And Lady Wilde then, rather foolishly, wrote a letter to Travers, maybe here even in the library, telling him to look after his daughter, that she was intriguing with her husband, and more and more and more stuff, and to stop it altogether. Now, Travers threw it into a press in his bedroom. Mary Josephine must have been rooting around in their house in Blackrock, found the letter, cleverly realised that it was libelous, brought it to a solicitor, and started to take an action against really what was against Sir William Wilde, but because Lady Wilde wrote the letter, it was really against Lady Wilde. And so this huge libel case began. That is the biggest libel case still, I think, ever known in Dublin. The crowds came out in their thousands, so much so that the police had to control the crowds. Isaac Butt was her barrister. And of course, as I said to you, it was sensational. Now, the evidence came, and then eventually Robert Travers was called, and his evidence about getting the letter and answering it was not relevant to the case. But they questioned him, and they questioned Speranza. So you can imagine this big woman coming into court, haughty and arrogant. And so they asked her many, many questions. The Chief Justice at the time was a governor of Marshes Library, Henry Monaghan, and questions were asked of her as to what she knew about Robert Travers, and she said she didn't know anything about his literary activities. Can't you see maybe Meryl Streep playing that part in a film? And so the judge dismissed Mary Josephine's evidence as irrelevant altogether, and the jury awarded her 1 farthing's damages. Now, very sadly, although Robert Travers was a magnificent librarian, wonderful doctor, and did tremendous work here around the Liberties, particularly in Cork Street Hospital, where he actually lived in because he thought it was his duty to do so to help the patients. He also discovered that when Jenny Lind was in Dublin, that she left £400 for the private poor. And Travers wrote to the Archbishop of Dublin, who was chairman at that time of the governors, and asking could he give him some of that money to distribute here to the poor. And the Archbishop wrote back and said, rather sadly, I think, that Jenny Lind specifically mentioned the private poor and not institutions. But that was the kind of man he was. And he was so devoted, he'd been here for most of his life, actually. And he applied for the keeper's job when the keeper died. And he wasn't appointed. And there is nothing in the library about that case. Absolutely nothing. It was ignored. But they didn't appoint him. They appointed a clergyman instead, and Robert Travers did not get the job that he obviously longed for. So that's the story of Professor Robert Travers in Marsh's library.